December 1944. The Ardennes forest is a frozen hell. Hitler unleashes a surprise blitzkrieg, what we now call the Battle of the Bulge. The German army smashes through the American lines, creating a massive salient at the heart of this chaos, at a critical crossroads town called Bastogne. The American 101st Airborne Division is completely surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on everything. Their situation is desperate. Back at the Allied Supreme Headquarters, the mood is grim. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, is facing the greatest crisis of the war in the West. The German offensive has caught everyone off guard. He needs a miracle. He needs someone audacious, someone who can move mountains, or in this case an entire army through a blizzard. He needs George S. Patton. On December 19th, Eisenhower summons his top commanders to a meeting in Verdun. The room is thick with tension. When Eisenhower lays out the dire situation and asks what can be done, Patton, ever the showman, speaks up. He claims he can disengage his Third Army, currently fighting further south, pivot 90 degrees, and attack the German flank to relieve Bastogne. When Eisenhower asks how long it will take, Patton drops a bombshell. 48 hours. The other generals are stunned. Some are openly skeptical, even laughing. Moving 3 divisions over 100,000 men and all their equipment over 100 miles in the dead of winter on icy roads under constant threat of air attack, and then immediately launching a major counteroffensive in just 2 days. It sounded impossible. It was insane. Patton wasn't just proposing a plan. He was making a boast that seemed to defy the laws of logistics and warfare. But Eisenhower knew his man. He knew Patton was arrogant, flamboyant, and often insubordinate. But he also knew Patton was a brilliant, aggressive tactician who thrived on the impossible. He saw the fire in Patton's eyes and made his decision. He looked at Patton and said simply, "Go." It was a moment of immense trust, putting the fate of the 101st Airborne, and perhaps the entire battle, into the hands of his most controversial general. What the other generals didn't know was that Patton, anticipating this very scenario, had already ordered his staff to draw up 3 different contingency plans for a northward attack. He wasn't just boasting. He was prepared. He stormed out of the meeting, famously telling his staff, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." For Patton, this wasn't a crisis. It was his moment to shine. The race to Bastogne was on. Patton's Third Army began one of the most incredible feats of military logistics in history. Convoys of trucks, tanks, and artillery snaked along frozen, narrow roads, day and night. The Red Ball Express, the famed Allied supply service, was redirected to fuel Patton's charge. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, snow, and ice. It was a brutal, relentless march. Patton was everywhere, a whirlwind of energy, roaring at his men, pushing them forward, demanding the impossible and getting it. He famously said, "A pint of sweat will save a gallon of blood." His men were sweating and freezing in equal measure. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was holding on by a thread. The Germans demanded their surrender. The acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, gave a legendary one-word reply that echoed the division's defiance: nuts. It was a massive morale booster, but words couldn't stop German tanks. They were running out of ammunition, food and medical supplies. They scanned the southern horizon, praying for Patton's promised relief. As Patton's forces drew closer, the weather, which had favored the Germans by grounding Allied air power, finally broke. On December 23rd, the skies cleared. The U.S. Army Air Forces swarmed the skies, dropping desperately needed supplies to the 101st and pounding German positions. It was the Christmas present the besieged soldiers had been praying for. Finally, on December 26th, the day after Christmas, the lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division, specifically a unit called Task Force Bomb, broke through the German lines and linked up with the defenders of Bastogne. The siege was broken. Patton had done it. He had marched his army over 100 miles in the harshest winter conditions and relieved the 101st Airborne not in 48 hours, but it was an astonishingly fast and decisive maneuver that completely changed the momentum of the Battle of the Bulge. What did the Supreme Commander say when Patton, his problem child, delivered the victory he so desperately needed? After receiving the news, Eisenhower's official reaction was, as you'd expect, professional and composed. He sent a message commending the Third Army for their splendid performance and their skill and guts. Publicly, it was all about the professionalism of the Allied forces, but privately, Eisenhower's feelings were much more complex and revealing. His relationship with Patton was famously turbulent. He respected Patton's genius as a field commander but was constantly exasperated by his lack of political sense and his headline-grabbing antics. Eisenhower had to be a statesman, balancing military strategy with political alliances. Patton was a pure warrior who cared only for battle, according to historical accounts and letters. Eisenhower's private reaction was one of profound relief and deep, if grudging, admiration. He knew he had made the right call. He had bet on Patton, and Patton had delivered beyond anyone's wildest expectations. In a letter to his wife Mamie, Eisenhower expressed his immense pride in the American soldier, and implicitly, in commanders like Patton, who could lead them to do the impossible. But there's a more telling declaration that captures the essence of their relationship. Later, After the battle, Eisenhower was discussing Patton's incredible drive to Bastogne. He reportedly turned to a colleague and said something to the effect of, "George, you are one of a kind." It wasn't a flowery commendation. It wasn't a formal medal citation. But in those few words, there was a universe of meaning. It was an acknowledgement of Patton's unique, untamable, and indispensable nature. Eisenhower was essentially saying, "You drive me crazy, you're a political nightmare, but there is no one else in the world who could have done what you just did." It was the ultimate compliment from a commander who valued results above all else. He understood that to win a war, you needed thinkers and planners like himself. But you also needed fighters, pure, unrelenting warriors like George Patton. The relief of Bastogne was the ultimate vindication of Eisenhower's often difficult decision to keep Patton in command. He knew that Patton's flaws were the flip side of the very aggression, an audacity that had just saved the 101st Airborne and turned the tide in the Allies' darkest hour in Europe. The story of Bastogne is often told as a story of the 101st Airborne's grit or Patton's genius. But it's also the story of Eisenhower's leadership, his ability to manage the massive egos of his subordinates, to recognize the right tool for the right job, and to trust his instincts even when the stakes were impossibly high. His simple declaration, recognizing Patton as one of a kind, reveals more than any formal report ever could. It was the quiet acknowledgement from one great general to another that in the crucible of war, sometimes you need a maverick, a gambler, a warrior who believes he can do the impossible, and then does it. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the past. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Eisenhower-Patton dynamic. See you next time.